The 1814-1816 Anglo-Nepal War was a very important period for British relations with Nepal, of course, but also crucially with Sikkim. And that's what I want to talk about in my presentation. And I want to focus particularly on the two leading British figures who were engaged with Sikkim in that period. It's always a good idea to say something nice about your chairman, so he gives you some extra minutes. Alex's first book was about the frontier cadre of British officials in the 20th century, and my paper is not a sequel but a prequel. I'm talking about the frontier cadre in the early 19th century. There are various themes. Overall, of course, this is a story about battles, it's about war and diplomacy. But there's a sub-theme, which is also a sub-theme of other papers in this conference. It's about knowledge and communication, or perhaps I should say about lack of knowledge and lack of communication, and efforts to overcome it. I should also say that my paper is based on two sets of archives, and this is an incomplete picture. Part of the point of presenting it is to share what I've been able to find, but also to make a contribution to building up a more complete picture from Nepali sources and from Sikkimese sources. So to start with, I want to give a kind of geopolitical overview, and I have this map. The map itself is imperfect, which is in itself a kind of metaphor. There are variant spellings. That also reflects the sources. It actually comes from one of Alistair Lamb's books. One other thing to say about the map is that it puts Sikkim in the center, and that's where it should be. There are two ways of seeing a place like Sikkim. You can, of course, say that it's on the periphery. It's on the periphery of China, it's on the of Tibet or of India. But places like that, you can also look at them as being the center. Here is Sikkim in the middle, and there are these other places circling around it. By way of geopolitical introduction, I want to bring you back to the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. In this period, Britain had strongly established itself in Bengal from the 1750s onwards. Its expansion across India was still in progress. It was by no means incomplete. In the same period, the Gurkha kingdom was expanding both east and west, and one of the contemporary British historians writing in the 1820s, he was H.D. Prinsep, British official himself, and he draws an analogy. He says that the Gurkhas themselves compare their expansion with British expansion, and he says, not inaptly. It's been a kind of similar process of expansion. Arguably, these expanding empires sooner or later were going to clash. There was already from the time of Warren Hastings was upset about what he regarded as the Nepalis interrupting trade links between northern India via Kathmandu with Tibet. The actual occasion for the conflict, the cause of the conflict, was characteristically, it was a boundary dispute in what is now northern Bihar. The main conflict which followed, the British had a strategy, a four-pronged strategy, and the main prongs were areas which are to the west of here. But Sikkim also played a role, and the British strategy was that the area here, it wasn't one of the four prongs, but the idea was to create a diversion, to occupy Gurkha energies so that the main four prongs further to the west could be more successful. And the two British officials who played the leading role, one was a civilian, he was a magistrate, his name was David Scott, and the other was the military commander, his name was Barré latter, and those are the two main protagonists of my paper. So before talking about what they did, I want to say a bit about who they were, what was their personal history. looking at the personal history, I'm quite struck by, to use an anthropological term, kinship networks. Starting with Barré latter, the first thing which is a bit unusual about his name, Barré, it seems that he was probably a Huguenot from a Huguenot family. Huguenots were French Protestants who fled from France mainly in the late 17th century. I have some Huguenot ancestors myself. He was born in London. His father was from Harley Street, which is famous as a street full of doctors. And he went to school at Rugby, which is still a famous school, produced lots of imperial administrators. If you look at the register for his year, half of them seem to be military officers, and the other half seem to be doctors. He was registered, he was admitted to Lincoln's Inn, so it seems, which is a centre for lawyers in London, as a teenager. But still as a teenager, he joined the Bengal Army. He came here, he was only, I think, 19. And he was one of 3 brothers who were all in the Bengal Army. 2 of them died young. He died at age 45. The one who survived went on to become a general. So he was the first one, and he's the one I'm going to talk most about. The second one, David Scott, he actually was a Scot. He was a civilian, as I say. He was nominated by his uncle, who was likewise called David Scott. He was actually a director and indeed a chairman of the East India Company. And his early career, he arrived in India even younger. He was only 16. His education here was in Fort William College in Calcutta. And then his early postings were in Gorakhpur and then in Rangpur. Rangpur at that time was the civilian center in northern Bengal, and one of Scott's predecessors had been George Bogle. The British tried to set up a trading center, an annual fair dealing with Bhutan, and they hoped to fire Bhutan with Tibet. So, right at the beginning of the war, the set of instructions was sent by the Secretary of the Government to both David Scott and to Latter, and the instructions, they were sent in November 1814, and it's a kind of manifesto of British policy in this area, and also, in fact, a summary of British knowledge of Sikkim. So the first letter is the most important one, and it's to David Scott, and it says, we think that in your district you can probably find somebody who can make contact with Sikkim, and via Sikkim with Nepal. Via Sikkim with Lhasa. And what our understanding is that Sikkim has been engaged in a kind of long-running conflict with Nepal. Nepal has taken territory from Sikkim, and therefore our suggestion is that maybe the Chogyal, the term they use is the Raja of Sikkim, he was the 7th Raja, he might think it's in his interest to join with us to put pressure on the Gorkhas, and the incentive, the enticement is that we will be victorious. When we are victorious, they had no real doubt, he would be able to regain some of the territory which he lost. He also said, he was fairly specific, the territory which he would regain was the territory which the Gorkhas had taken. He also refers that in the more distant past there was Sikkim territory further in the plains which they had lost during the Muslim conquest, expansion in India. The British were going to keep that. He wasn't to get too hopeful for how much territory he was going to regain. That was one point. The second point was Sikkim, they knew, had close relations with Lhasa, and through Lhasa with China, and he wanted to send a message. The message was the British quarrel was with the Gorkhas, not with Tibet, not with China, and they should understand that. The British had limited objectives and they wanted to make that clear. The Lord Moore, as he then was, Lord Hastings, as he became the Governor-General, he was always quite concerned about China. In fact, very concerned about China, not only because of this region, but also because of the implications for British interests in Canton and that area, which is economically much more important. The second letter was a shorter letter to Captain Latter, and it was saying, please use your connections to make contact with the Kirantis, who had likewise have been conquered by the Gorkhas, and the idea was that he might be able to help foment a kind of uprising, likewise to put pressure on the Gurkhas. What actually happened? So in these instructions, the idea seemed to be that David Scott would play the lead role and Captain Latter would play the secondary role. What actually happened was that in practice it was the other way around. And there were two reasons for this. The first reason was that it was a time of war and the military commander naturally took a kind of precedence. The second was that the Chogyal on his own initiative made contact with Captain Latter, and so the main correspondence seems to have continued with him. So quite early on, so already at the end of 1814, Latter received a letter picking up on my theme of communication and non-communication. It's not quite clear to me in the records what language the letter was in, but at any rate it was a language which neither Latter nor any of his staff understood. I myself have always thought the letter was in Tibetan, but I do see, looking at a later letter, it does say explicitly it was in Lepcha. It's actually possible that he didn't himself know the difference. At any rate, it was in a letter they didn't understand. I should say that in this period, the official language of diplomacy across northern India was Persian. And that was also the language which was used between Lhasa and Calcutta, with some problems. But anyway, he had a summary of the letter, and the letter was basically saying, I agree, not I agree. On his own, he'd come to the same idea that there should be some kind of alliance. And the idea was that you, Latter, take care of the lowlands, and I'll take care of the highlands, and together we will attack the Gurkhas. So there was broad agreement on objectives. The question then was when should they actually take action? And this was the Gurkhas, as George van Driem said in his presentation, they had a justified reputation for ferocity, for mutilations of people in the Kiranti area. So it was very important that the Sikkim shouldn't come into the war prematurely. What happened was that in early 1815, the main four prongs were not successful. It was a combination of bad military tactics by the British. It was also at this period that they started forming their admiration for the Gurkhas. Latter had more limited objectives, and he was relatively successful in acquiring territory in this area. And in March 1815, he said, right now the time has come, Sikkim should join the war, and they should besiege this area, written in my bad handwriting, the fort of Nagri. They should put pressure on that fort in association with the British. There's quite a revealing incident at this point, which is that Latter had an order to send some of his troops back down to this region off the map to support General Wood. He actually said, and he argued back against the military leadership. He said, no, that's not the right thing to do. And he said, and the reason why was that he had made a commitment. He had made a commitment to Sikkim, and he didn't want to leave Sikkim exposed. And the words he used are quite important. He said, I've made a commitment, and I regard this commitment as having the same force as if I had made a treaty with Sikkim. I'm stressing that because the picture which comes across is that he was able to establish a position of quite considerable trust with the Sikkimese, And that was important for what took place later. Over the summer of 1815, there was then something of a lull, and one can understand why. It's because of the monsoon season. Latter himself seems to have been personally exhausted, and he withdrew, and it seems that David Scott at that point did take over diplomatic links with Sikkim. And then in November, December, there was a preliminary treaty with Nepal, which however wasn't ratified. At this point again, there is a sort of interesting episode of miscommunication or non-communication. One of the British officials had sent a message to Sikkimese. The language that was used, it said in the British record, Sepahi. I think that means Sepoy language, military language. I think it means Urdu. That language was misunderstood. The Sikkimese understood it as meaning, please send lots of troops to attack the Gorkhas. What it was actually saying was, we need some porters. Latta had to, at this point there was a kind of lull in the fighting, so Latta had to unravel that, pacify the Sikkimese who were keen to go and attack the Gorkhas, and say, no, not yet. What he then did was to make sure that there was Sikkimese in his camp, so to speak, to establish regular communications. And it's quite striking, again, the language which he uses, which is that he is very confident of the Sikkimese. I have to say that it's the language is a little bit patronized, so it may not please the Sikkimese among us, but he says, I cannot conclude the report, this is in December 1815, without mentioning the ability and sound judgment displayed by the Qazi, the minister, and other siddhas, which proves that their nation, though hitherto scarcely known to Europeans, does not rank low in the scale of intellectual attainment. Okay, a little bit patronizing, but nonetheless positive view of the Sikkimese. What then happens in early 1816 was the Nepalis don't ratify the treaty. War does start again. There is a kind of joint siege of Nagri. The Nepalis don't surrender. Latta sends a letter to the commander of the fort and says, surrender, it's too late. He sends a rather heroic letter back and said, I don't surrender, it's not in my orders. But in fact, the war came to an end before he was forced to surrender. So the Gorkhas didn't actually surrender before the end of the war. There's then a bit of a hiatus, and leading up, there's then a bit of a hiatus. So at this point, I will leave Sikkim before discussing how the hiatus was resolved, and now I want to bring in Bhutan. David Scott, as I say, didn't play the lead with Sikkim, but he did play the lead with Bhutan. He sent a Bengali emissary called Kishan Kant Bose, who spent about a year in Bhutan. According to Bose's account, he had rather a miserable time because the weather was bad, and he was concerned, being a Hindu, he was concerned about the fact that he wasn't going to get the right food, and the Bhutanese weren't Hindus and were going to treat him badly. He paints a rather pitying picture of the time he had in Bhutan. He did, however, work quite hard, and in the connection with knowledge again, he wrote an account of Bhutan, which was published about 40 years later. He also wrote a vocabulary and grammar of the Bhutan language. From the geopolitical point of view, he was able to establish one thing, which is that the Gorkhas had sent emissaries to Bhutan saying, please join us against the British. Bhutan had said no, basically because it's too dangerous. They also said there's no point, because our people, we can't fight on the plains, because if we do, we'll get sick. and so he rejected the Gurkhas. Switching back to wider diplomacy, in the summer of 1816, the China element comes in. The Nepalis had sent an appeal to the emperor, please help us, the British are attacking Nepal, and if they conquer Nepal, probably they will attack Tibet. The Chinese were rather slow to respond, but then in the summer of 1816, an army appeared in Lhasa, and both the Nepalis and the British were rather anxious about this. The Nepalis, having appealed for help, were now concerned that instead of being a sort of help, that the Chinese army was going to be a threat to Nepal. For the purposes of this paper, the point I wanted to emphasize was the role of Sikkim. Sikkim had now emerged as the main channel of communication with Lhasa and via Lhasa with China. And there is a nice letter from Latter, and he says, September 1816, he's reporting news from Lhasa that the Chinese are scolding the Nepalis for creating so much trouble. Again, this is the letter which is apparently written in lecture, which he can't read. Critical point though, he says the Lama at Lhasa, I suppose that means the Dalai Lama, has been very instrumental in achieving this object, and the Sikkim Raja's influence has been successfully exerted through the whole negotiation. So it was through this war that Sikkim begins to emerge as one of the main channels of communication, both politically and otherwise. Keeping an eye on the time, 5 minutes, okay. 6 minutes. For the summer of 1816, oh dear, I do have to rush a bit, how bad. The Sikkim Raja, the Chogyal, doesn't yet get his land back because there was still some uncertainty about the wider geopolitical situation. But the Treaty of Titalia is the main military centre, signed by Latter and by a group of Sikkimese ministers. It does restore Darjeeling and some of the lowland area, likewise restored in a kind of follow-up Sanad decree. Some of the East Moran, which the British later took away, but at this point it was granted to given back to Sikkim. Key points about this, under the treaties both with Nepal and with Sikkim, British appoint themselves as intermediaries for any disputes between Nepal and Sikkim. So Sikkim becomes, the word isn't quite used, but in effect it becomes already a kind of quasi-protectorate of the British. So then, relatively briefly, I now want to switch to a second aspect and a second set of archives about Captain Latter. And these are missionary archives. In the Church Missionary Archives now in Birmingham, there's a whole set of letters from Latter. By his personal beliefs, he was an evangelical Christian. And already in 1816, he writes to the Church Missionary Society representatives in Calcutta, and he says, now is a great opportunity. Please send a missionary here to learn Tibetan. And so, in summary, he emerges in this period, the remaining 6 years of his life, he died in 1822, as a kind of patron of British studies of Tibetan or missionary studies. The CMS, Church Missionary Society, sent a German missionary to Titalia, and in early 1817, he made a visit to Sikkim with a British map maker, and then he also died young. He spent 4 years studying Tibetan with the help of a manuscript produced by Italian missionaries in the 18th century. That dictionary was finally published in 1826. In effect, it was a kind of working draft that was published by the Baptist Mission in Calcutta. It is important because it was the first Tibetan English dictionary ever published, although it was superseded 8 years later by Choma de Curas's dictionary. Latter's role in this was, as I say, as a kind of patron of Schröter, the German missionary. He was also a book collector. He collected books not only in this area, but he also, through a friend of his apparently in France, letters which had gone from the Italian missionaries to France, dispersed during the revolution. He collected some of them. It's not clear whether he collected manuscripts, but he did at least collect the Alphabetum Tibetanum, which was one of the early printed books. In his will, the only item which is mentioned specifically is a collection of Tibetan books, and he said that should go to an institute of learning. In Britain, they actually went to Bishop's College in Calcutta. I think some of them may be still there, but they weren't used. David Scott, the final years of his life, he played an important role in the First Anglo-Burmese War and in the annexation of Assam, so outside our geographical area. He finally died in 1831. So, winding up as a kind of summary, I have rushed the last bit, we can come back to it in questions, but my sort of concluding summary is how we should look at these people. First and foremost, we should look at these people as contemporaries. Contemporaries of who they were. They were servants of the East India Company at the time when Britain was in one of its more expansionist periods. That was the role that they played. They were not liberal academics. Having said that, my sense is that they were quite skillful in what they do. My idea of what a good diplomat is, a good diplomat of course represents their country, the East India Company, but in order to be an effective diplomat, you need to understand what the interest of the other party is. And my sense is that within their limitations, they did that. And I think that comes across both in latter, the way he writes about the Sikkimese. To some extent, he represents the Sikkimese to the East India Company. He represents them, for example, in the Sanad, which follows the Treaty of Tatalia. He says that economically Sikkim needs some lowland territory. We don't need it. It makes sense that Sikkim should have that territory, even though later British people took it away again. On the question of knowledge, I think we should neither be fair, or we should be realistic. In some of the earlier historical discussions, it's been pointed out that our historical knowledge is partial. Their contemporary knowledge was also partial. They had to take decisions on the basis of the incomplete information which they had, and that is what they did do. So, and they made a small contribution, but they did also make a contribution to wider learning through being a patron of Kishan Kant Bose and through Schröter. So there is my concluding point is that I think there is a kind of lineage of British officials in their engagement in Tibet. We know about Bogle and we know about Samuel Turner, and we also know about Charles Bell and Richardson, all British officials who made a wider contribution. But there was actually a big gap in the 19th century. People were not of the same stature as the other ones I've mentioned, but they were in the lineage. If we're drawing an iconographic picture of them, I think Bogle should be quite big, and Bell should be quite big, and Richardson. These ones would be quite small, but I think they should be there nevertheless. And so I hope my presentation helps give you an idea about who they were, and by making my contribution to the Nepali sources and the Sikkimese sources, helps build up a wider picture. Thank you.
Interesting paper, I must enlighten that you remark aptly that Emlo Barthawar is a great episode in the Trans-Himalayan politics, and you are left lasting impact in the politics. And it is true that the main cause of the Emlo Barthawar was the expandist policy initiated by both Gorkha and Nepal. I do use the term not unification of Nepal but expansion of Gorkha. and as you, most of the writers term as Anglo-Gotha War, but you write the term Anglo-Nepal War. I would rather prefer to say Company Nepal War. And
I don't know Nepal War.
Anglo,
No,
Company Nepal War.
Okay.
And during the period, both Company and Nepal keenly ventured to seek assistance from the adjoining countries. And their motto was entirely different. Nepal was badly in need of help, either military or military, while the main intention of company was to prevent any sort of alliance between Nepal and other small countries. So, I do believe that the main intention behind sending the mission was to prevent any sort of alliance between Nepal and others, and to explore the exact nature of Nepal-Tibet-China relation. Because during this period, the company was quite uncertain about the nature of Nepal-Tibet-China relation, as Nepal was repeatedly provoking, instigating rather, Tibet and China. The main intention of company is to attack Tibet, not Nepal. Nepal prevented them for a passage to go to Tibet. That is why they have declared war. So I want to know that how far the objectives of the diplomatic mission was realized.
Diplomatic mission to where? To
These two, just you.
yeah. Okay. First of all, they had interest in trade relations with Tibet, but they had no interest in territorial expansion in Tibet. How far the objectives were realized, they had limited objectives, which was to prevent a problem, and somehow or other it didn't become a problem. They seem to have been a little bit unclear, continued to be unclear about what exactly the Chinese motives were, but the limited objectives were achieved. Via the Sikkim route, and the Bhutan route also, at least Bhutan was out of the war, and so those limited objectives were, I think, achieved.
I'll take you for realize.
Thank you, Professor Swiger.
Yeah, John, first thank you for the great paper. I enjoyed it. You have left one blind spot in it, and I would like to know if you know a little bit more about it. You always said very interesting how the communication went with Lhasa. It was via Sikkim, but who actually was on the other end of the line? Who was the addressee? Who was sending the messages from Lhasa back? Do you know anything? You just say Lhasa and then you say the Chinese, but...
Okay, I think there's more than one. So my impression is that but it is an impression, and I will go back on the sources and look more carefully because I think it's a good question. My impression is that the letter that I quoted, it was the Sikkimese Chogyal using his contacts, and they must have been fairly senior Tibetan contacts. However, I have another theme which I'm really interested in, which is the role of Kashmiris. In this period, there were two particular sets of people who operated on both sides of the boundary, who were not worried about climate. One was the Gosains, and you remember the Bogle was accompanied by Gosain Gurangir, and the other were Kashmiri merchants. And both sides used the Kashmiri merchants as sources of information, but also as message carriers. Specifically, in this period, the diary of the Governor-General does say that we had a message from a Kashmiri contact in Lhasa reporting what the Chinese had said.
But actually, I know I've dealt with these earlier Walker War, and of course you know that Persian was language and all this, but actually, I mean, who was the one who was writing the letters in Lhasa? At that time it was the Dalai Lama, but he was writing on behalf of the Amans in Lhasa. That's very important. I mean, you know, actually who was in power in Lhasa and who was competent. To think that the Chinese got aware of all the problems so late.
Okay, I think it is a good question, and I will go back and look at it a little more closely. What I'm rather feeling my way there. One thing which one comes across is that it's very convenient for both sides to be inexplicit about what messages are going across. So the armbands are the front line, and they sometimes, on several occasions, I think more than one, they deny that they've contacted Beijing, but actually they have. And I suspect that something similar is going on here. But I will look again a little bit more closely. There is a whole there is a file which I haven't read in detail. I only scanned it because I had limited time in London, and it's in the summer of 1816. By this time there was a British resident in Kathmandu. And there's a whole lot of correspondence about whether the British should send somebody in person to Lhasa, whether that was either desirable or whether it was possible. I think that might give a clue, but at this point don't know much more.
Okay. Thank you for shedding so much light on this period, which we do need to study more. Thank you very much, John.